Assemblyman Morris.
Question 247 to the Secretary of Health, Wellness and Social Protection.
Secretary B. Yisrael.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. 247. What is the status of the incinerators owned by the TRHA? The TRHA currently owns 2 incinerators. Are they all functioning? No, one was decommissioned in 2023 and one is functional. Have private services been procured to provide the service to date to cost? Yes, private services have been procured and the date to cost is $8.596 million.
Follow-up, Assemblyman Morris.
Madam Presiding Officer, can the Secretary tell us why was the one of the incinerators decommissioned and why we are now paying $8.4 million in that service when we could have had the incinerator?
One question, minority.
So the question is, why was it decommissioned in preference for paying $8 million, almost $9 million to a Trinidad contractor?
Secretary B. Yisrael.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. The incinerators the incinerator was decommissioned because it was at the end of its life. I'm sure many of us who are in the public would remember smoke emanating from up the fort myriad of times, indicating that it was not working as it should. Several attempts were made at fixing. Several costly attempts were made at fixing, which did not work, Madam Presiding Officer. But to truly answer the question, Madam Presiding Officer, I would ask the members of this House and the viewing public to go back to a moment during COVID, Madam Presiding Officer, when I, as a minority councillor at that time, walked up the fort, Madam Presiding Officer, and discovered that there was a situation where biohazardous materials were not being treated with at that time, Madam Presiding Officer. As a matter of fact, I am the one who took the video. I am the one who posted the video on Facebook. I am the one that forced them to tell us at that time that there was somewhat of a backlog, Madam Presiding Officer, and that they were treating with it. They had also indicated, Madam Presiding Officer, that there was a microwavable incinerator that should be working and so forth. All of that happened, Madam Presiding Officer. To my surprise, Madam Presiding Officer, when I became Secretary with responsibility for health, wellness, and social protection, I got a call, a whistleblower maybe, somebody from the TRHA who said, Madam Secretary, I think you need to make a visit to the old fort where the incinerator is housed. I think you should make a visit. And Madam Presiding Officer, I obliged. I went, I took a look at the facility, recognizing that what was stored at the fort, Madam Presiding Officer, was probably up to 5, possibly 10 years worth of biohazardous material, Madam Presiding Officer. As a matter of fact, when we looked at the rooms, if you know the old fort, the old hospital, Madam Presiding Officer, when we look at the rooms that were the mortuary, if you look at the rooms that were the storage for the dispensary, if you look at the buildings that were above that, Madam Presiding Officer, we actually recognized that there was, in addition to all of those rooms being filled with biohazardous material, Madam Presiding Officer, that there was also a 40-foot container that was also filled with biohazardous material, Madam Presiding Officer. So when we recognized what was happening, and of course, as we indicated, Madam Presiding Officer, that the incinerator was at the end of its life and it could not work, we recognized that something needed to happen, Madam Presiding Officer. So the private contractor, Madam Presiding Officer, is actually doing 2 sets of incinerating. The contractor is incinerating the backlog in addition to current waste. As a matter of fact, we recognize, Madam Presiding Officer, that the rooms that we saw, Madam Presiding Officer, that were filled at that time, Madam Presiding Officer, weren't even all of the rooms. Because we learned after, Madam Presiding Officer, that if you go upstairs, the said building, Madam Presiding Officer,
Secretary,
all of those rooms,
Secretary,
all of those rooms
Secretary
were
B. Israel.
filled. So we are completing that process,
Listen,
Madam Presiding
listen.
Officer.
Assemblyman Morris, I don't need your support. I think I could handle the chair. Thanks. And your question, I believe, has been answered in its entirety. Follow-up question, Assemblyman Morris.
So, Madam, after that long-winded explanation, I simply want to know, what is the cost to operationalize an incinerator? Because I'm hearing you paid over $9 million. So
Question, Assemblyman
so for the people
Morris.
of Tobago, we want to know what is the cost to operationalize our own incinerator, the one that we will own.
Assemblyman B. Israel.
Madam Presiding Officer, I'm not sure that that was one of the questions there, so I cannot give you the cost of what it would cost us to operationalize. However, Madam Presiding,
Continue.
Madam Presiding Officer, I guess this may be a good time to announce that we have actually procured a new incinerator that I understand landed in Trinidad recently that needs to be installed and so forth. So I cannot provide the answer in terms of what it will cost because I do not have that information at this point since it was not one of the questions, I don't think, on the order.
Follow-up, Assemblyman Morris.
So we've purchased an incinerator and we don't know how much we pay for it. Is that what the secretary is saying? I just want confirmation.
Question, is that your question?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Secretary B. Israel.
Yes, Madam Presiding Officer, as I indicated, the question was what is the overall cost of providing the service, and I have indicated that since that was not one of the questions, I am not prepared to answer that question at this point, and no, I do not know the cost of the incinerator that we purchased off the top